Hey Wargamers, we're starting to get a better idea of how Tyranids are going to work in 8th edition 40k thanks to some leaked images of the upcoming Index Xenos 2. That's the index that has Tau, it has Orcs, it has Tyranids in it, as well as Genestealer cults. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about the Tyranid aspect of that, what it means for army composition, some of the big changes, and what it means for the meta and how the game is going to play with Tyranids. So before we do that though, I want to say thanks for watching. If you like this video, if you like my other videos, go ahead, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, and the notification bell. That way you don't miss any of my upcoming 8th edition videos, because there's going to be tons to talk about in the upcoming weeks. So subscribe. All right, big things that have changed. We're going to start big. We're going to go little. Big things that have changed. Synapse now works much more smoothly. Basically, it allows units within 8 inches to 8 inches of a Synapse creature to automatically pass their morale test. This is huge for any of the smaller units, anything that has multiple models in it, because as we know from our 8th edition previews, morale checks are going to be happening all the time. They're going to affect everybody, and it's going to be painful. Basically, the new morale system works that you are penalized for taking more and more wounds, for losing more models. Basically, the more you lose, the more you're going to lose due to morale checks. So being able to ignore that mechanic altogether is huge for units with multiple models, especially for these units that Tyranids rely on, like Termagants, that have many models in them and are going to be losing models relatively easily due to small arms fire. This allows a way out of that, and I think is a great asset for the Tyranid army. The flip side of Synapse, of course, is that many of the non-Synapse creatures have instinctual behavior, and that has been toned down a lot with the previous codex. It was really complicated. It had a lot of different potential effects. They simplified it. Basically, if you are a instinctual behavior creature and you are outside of Synapse range, you can only shoot or charge the nearest enemy unit. There's no more having to move in a certain direction in order to get into cover. There's none of these extreme buffs or nerfs to units based on being in Synapse. Instead, you just have to move. You just have to charge or shoot at models that are closer to you, and that's fine. That's really what I think Tyranids are going to want to be doing anyway. And so yes, it gives you a little less flexibility if you are outside of Synapse, but it's not the end of the world. It's not completely crippling. It does give your opponent some opportunity to basically kite you around, basically nullify some of your shooting or charging abilities, but nonetheless, I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think this new Synapse and instinctual behavior balance is really nice and makes Tyranids work in a way that is fluffy, but also still facilitates a strong presence on the tabletop. Another big aspect of Tyranids, of course, is Shadows in the Warp, or Shadows of the Warp, and that's been changed to basically just be a -1 to leadership, to psychic tests within 8 inches of a creature with Shadow of the Warp. So again, an 8-inch range with Synapse, we're able to extend that using some special characters, but overall we're talking about 8-inch range for Synapse and also for Shadow of the Warp, and that's a pretty small bubble. I think I'd like to see Shadow of the Warp be a larger bubble than 8 inches, but then again, these Tyranids are probably going to be moving up closer to the enemy than further away, so it's really not that big of a deal. They're going to be closer to the enemy than further away, so that's an asset. And in some ways, having a smaller bubble allows you to mess with your opponent's mind a little bit more. If it was a huge bubble and everyone was always in Shadow of the Warp, feeling that negative effect, then your opponent wouldn't be afraid to move any closer to you or to move in a certain way that would expose them to more of a negative effect. Now with this, the opponent is going to be a little bit apprehensive of going in close, and so that gives you, the Tyranid player, the opportunity to dictate the flow of battle, which is good. All right, speaking of psychic powers, there are 3 psychic powers that you can either randomly allocate or pick at the beginning of the battle for each of your psychers. The first is Horror, and that's a 24-inch range. It gives the targeted unit -1 to hit and -1 to leadership. So two things here. One is that it's going to make your morale tests a lot more impactful. It's going to make them 1 wound more impactful, which is good. And also means that they're less likely to hurt you. The -1 to hit is huge, especially given how things scale now. A -1 to hit is just about the same thing as doubling your toughness or having their strength, which is really important. So that's cool. And this is a 6 warp charge cast, and all 3 of these are 6 warp charge casts. So you're going to be able to reliably cast all 3 of these more often than not. The second power is Catalyst, and that is a 18-inch range. It basically gives a unit feel no pain. This is something, again, that's probably going to be more useful on units that are multi-model, armies that use a lot of small bugs as opposed to large bugs. Onslaught is the third power, and that's again an 18-inch range. It allows the targeted friendly unit to move and shoot heavy weapons, whereas normally there would be a penalty to that. Advance and shoot assault weapons, whereas normally there would be a penalty for that as well. And they can also charge after shooting, so after advancing. So that's huge. That's really important for Tyranids because, again, we're looking at an army that wants to be mid to close range or an assault, and giving them that extra maneuverability is a big deal. So I think probably most often you're going to see the Horror and Onslaught being the 2 favorite powers here, with the exception of having Catalyst on just a couple of the Psychers in the army in order to provide greater support for some of these large model count units. Another big change is something that I really like. It's super fluffy and it's cool, and it works to the benefit of Tyranids, and that is that the monstrous creatures, the big bugs in the Tyranid army, have this thing called death throws, and it varies in extent to some degree, but basically big bugs, when they die, are going to be doing mortal wounds to nearby enemy units. So nearby enemy units, if a Swarm Lord or a Turvagon or a Moloch dies near them, they're going to be basically punched in the face by this monster as it's flailing about and dying and writhing in pain, which is really cool. It makes there be some consequence to your opponent killing your monstrous creatures at close proximity. It makes them a little bit more concerned about their positioning again, and it gives you one last insult to your opponent. So that's good. You guys may have noticed I was thinking about a different thing, and I didn't. This is supposed to be a friendly channel, so I'm not going to say it. But death throws, very nice addition to the Tyranid army list. Now moving into some of the more unit-specific changes, we see that there's basically a new way of conceptualizing the Tyranid army. They pick 3 different classes of bugs. They look at Gene Stealers, Tyranid Warriors, and Termagants as basically these 3 different casts of bugs within the army, and each one of those casts is associated with some sort of like leadership bug that can enhance the ability of those smaller guys within a certain range. So for Gene Stealers, of course, it's a Brood Lord. For Tyranid Warriors, it's a Tyranid Prime, and for Termagants, it's a Turvagon. They all have bubble abilities that increase the ability of those respective units in shooting or in close combat, and it's really cool. It's really fluffy. It works well with the army, and it makes these smaller bugs a lot stronger. Basically allows them to reroll ones in certain situations, and that's awesome. So really think that that's going to be an important part for building your army later on, or building your army, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. But this is a cool design change in how the Tyranids are conceptualized. Flyers were a huge part of Tyranid armies in 6th and 7th edition, and they're still good, especially the Harpy I can see being a really big part of a lot of armies, but they're not quite as good as they used to be. They're not. It's not going to be a flying circus like it was in 7th edition. It's not going to be a bunch of wing hive tyrants and a bunch of harpies and hive crones just jumping around. It's going to be a much more terrestrial army, which is nice. I like that. All right, there's a few big winners in this new army list for Tyranids. The first are things that have acid blood as a special rule. So that's things like Pyrovores that previously would hurt your army when they died. So they'd be embedded in your army somewhere on the tabletop, and once they die, they would explode, and that would suck for the Tyranids, and really, potentially didn't harm the opponent at all. It just sucked for you as the Tyranid player. But now the tables have turned. Acid blood is much better. It does damage to the enemy unit that killed that model or destroyed that unit. It hurts them now. It does mortal wounds. It can pack quite a punch, and so in some ways you are not super sad when models with acid blood take damage, because you're going to be doing some notable damage in return for losing that model, which is good. So I think Pyrovores definitely got a huge boost in this change, as well as all the other acid blood models. I think are much better off now than they were before. Melee units, and I think this is probably kind of the biggest thing. Melee units are a big win. There are a lot of weapons that increase their accuracy, or just units that have high accuracy to begin with, do high damage. So we're talking like D3 damage or multiple damage points per weapon, and having moderate AP values. So -1, -2 AP are very common amongst the melee weapons. And so overall, I think melee is going to be a much bigger part of the Tyranid army list now. I think you're going to see a lot more melee units being used, and it's going to be more of a design element for Tyranid armies going forward, especially when we consider smaller units like Termagants, Armagants. Gene Stealers are beasts. They're awesome. So these guys are really going to provide a strong backbone for Tyranid armies, and they're going to be able to be supplemented with really powerful close combat monsters like the Swarm Lord. They're going to do very well, I think. And finally, the last big winner of this update are non-synapse creatures. We talked about this a little bit, but basically not being outside of synapse range isn't the end of the world anymore. It's going to leave some high model count units vulnerable to morale, but overall they're still going to be able to function, which is important. So non-synapse creatures, big win. What will armies look like going forward? Well, I think you're basically going to want to pick a lane. You're going to want to either go into Gene Stealers or into Warriors or into Termagants, and with that core unit, that core troop unit, you're going to pick that leader bug to go along with them, and then you're going to supplement in some big monstrous creatures like Harpies or the Swarm Lord or Pyrovores and a Tyrannocyte. I think all of these are going to be great additions to each one of those types of armies, depending on which way you go. And of course, as I said, Flying Circus is a lot less appealing, so you're going to see more terrestrial, more ground-based armies, and that is fantastic. Overall, I really like the changes that we're seeing here. It makes me excited because one of the reasons why I got into Tyranids was because I wanted an army that had a high model count, that was aggressive on the tabletop, fast, and was able to get into combat and do some damage. And the Tyranids look like they are, at least getting there. They are fast, they can do damage, their melee weapons look really nice. So I'm excited about this. Hopefully you are too, but either way, let me know what you think in the comments below, and of course, happy wargaming.